I want to try to ask you a question that hopefully will put some misconceptions or some information in the media that's been out there. And the question is, how many times have you taken the bar exam? When, where, and did you pass or did you fail? And do you consider yourself a lawyer?
You know, that's a great question. I went to a great law school. We got a good football team this year at the University of Michigan. And even going to a great law school doesn't guaranteedly with it you're going to pass the exam. I didn't pass it. Took it one time, and my mother really wants me to try it again. I took it right after I graduated from law school, and I was running for Congress. Had just been elected, and I learned a very valuable lesson. You should study for that doggone exam before you take it. And I was trying to serve in Congress and do the same thing. When President Bush was with Mayor Corker in Nashville, I think it was right at the end of August. They were raising money to try to beat me in this race. I think President Bush made a comment from the podium that we don't need any more lawyers in the Senate. And I just sat there and I wondered how Howard Baker and Lamar Alexander felt about that statement that the president had made. And I think during a session with my friend Tom Griscom, I'm going to call him my friend, the editor of the paper down here, publisher Tom Griscom, I made that point, and I think my opponent, in the midst of all this reorganizing in his campaign, that memo must have made its way to the top of the thing, and they began to push it and run with it a bit. Let me go back one time to the Iraq question, if I can. This is a very serious difference between my opponent and I. And I say serious because we find ourselves at a tipping point there. If we are unwilling, as a nation, to recognize that the bogged downedness that we find ourselves in Iraq could complicate our answer to what happens in North Korea and with the Iranians. If we don't recognize that, we're kidding and fooling ourselves. I believe a new strategy is needed in Iraq for, if no other reason, the American military cannot stay and referee a civil war. The model I would use there is a very simple one. Bosnia. The Croats, Serbs, and Muslims live apart but together. There's far less violence. The American military is on the ground along with the international force, and the casualty level is far less. We ought to strive for a similar model in Iraq and allow them the chance to build their future in the vision in the way that they choose. We can't force our way on them, but we certainly can help facilitate the creation and maturation of a thriving democracy. That should be our goal there.
Mr. Corker, 1 minute.
Well, thank you. My opponent constantly tries to make differences appear where differences don't exist and sameness appear where sameness doesn't exist. He's done a masterful job of that throughout the course of the campaign. I can see why he had a little trouble with that bar exam, because when you're in business, you have these things called contracts, and you just don't go around firing people. But what we did was quickly rectify the situation, quickly rectified, and the INS applauded us for what we did. So again, my opponent is trying to make an issue out of an issue that does not exist, and he's done this now. This is something that happened 18 years ago, and I think, again, it highlights the tremendous difference in background that we have. I've lived a life of meeting a payroll, of solving difficult problems, of building businesses, of creating jobs, of making budgets meet, making sure that there's a bottom line. I've lived a life in that regard. My opponent has lived a life in Washington, and it's a very, very different background.
Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker.
Sorry. Mr. Corker, what are your views on minimum wage?
Well, I've actually had minimum wage jobs. That's another difference between myself and my opponent. I think that certainly many of the people who have minimum wage jobs, like my daughter Emily, who's sitting in front of me, working at a coffee shop as a helper, many people that work in minimum wage jobs are obviously in transition jobs. About 85% of those jobs are young people who are just getting started in business. And obviously down on Broad Street and out on Access Road and a lot of places throughout the city, I've done that. But the fact is that obviously minimum wage is behind the times. It hasn't been adjusted in 10 years. What I'd like to see us do is, if we're going to look at the minimum wage increase, and obviously there are regions around the country which make it hard to, the cost of living in New York is, for instance, very, very different than it is here in Chattanooga, Tennessee. But the fact of the matter is that we need to look at that. But what I'd like to do at the same time, I'd like to make sure that we do everything we can to lessen the burdens that small businesses, mom and pop operators, hairstylists, people that have little construction companies, whatever they're doing, that they have burdens that are lessened for them, farmers. So I'd like to create a way of doing something with minimum wage, but also lessening some of the regulations or maybe the taxation that goes along with that for small business. But let me just tell you, what we ought to be focused on as a country is the same kind of thing that Mayor Littlefield and myself and Claude Ramsey and so many people here in Chattanooga have tried to do, and that is to create those good-paying jobs, to make sure that this is a place of innovation, that our youth understand the challenges of the future and are prepared to meet them, that we have an energy policy that calls us not to be dependent on the Middle East, that we're energy independent, and we pursue that with tremendous energy, just like we have the issues in our community, and that we make health care affordable and accessible so not just individuals, but companies that are trying to compete globally can do so. That ought to be our goal. And that's what I want to take to the United States Senate. And I've had a lifetime of experience in trying to make that happen. Thank you.
Mr. Ford, 1 minute.
Another big difference between my opponent and I. In the primary, in the Republican primary, he was opposed to the minimum wage increase. I don't quite know what he said there. Let me be clear. I've supported it every year in the Congress. If CEOs are worth $5 or $6, $7, $8 million a year, I know bottom line workers and those at the bottom of the wage level are worth $7.25 an hour. Mr. Corker, I did work in a minimum wage job. Matter of fact, I made beneath it. I worked as a parking attendant when I was in college. And prior to that, I worked in a little office as an office assistant at minimum wage. And prior to that, when I was in college, sir, I worked at the security desk in the building in which I lived at the University of Pennsylvania. There are a lot of differences between Mr. Corker and I, but here's the main one. If you want to stay the course on the minimum wage, on the war, on health care, and even immigration, I appreciate the little shot at me for not passing the bar, but sir, you ought to take responsibility for knowing that there were illegals working on your site and you did nothing to stop it.
Our next question is for Harold Ford, and it is from Chase Manning.
Representative Ford, how will you work to keep gas prices low? Are you for drilling in Alaska?
What's your last name, young fella?
Manning.
Mr. Maine. Two things, a great question because this is your future. The other question about paying the debt down and this represent two pillars that I think, the third one being education, that will help your future be far brighter and what I call you the tomorrow's patriots, to give you a future that is worthy fighting for. Here are the three things I think we need to recognize when it comes to energy independence. You can't win a war on terrorism if you pay for both sides of the war at the same time. That's what we're doing. Every time we fill up at the pump, and price for a barrel of oil has come down to a little below $60 a barrel. We shouldn't have to hope and pray when it comes to fulfilling our energy needs. We have the capacity, the ingenuity, and the innovation right here in Tennessee and all across rural America to grow our way out of the challenge that we face. When I introduced this idea or these ideas in this Senate race, my opponent called them hokey and suggested there was no way that America could grow its way out of it. I just happen to have a lot of confidence in farmers in this state and farmers all across this country. I also have some confidence in those at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which are helping to lead the research curve and finding ways to use nuclear energy in ways that we don't use it today. I happen to agree with the governor of Montana, a young fellow who believes that he has enough coal underneath his state to furnish us with more than 250 years of energy. These are the steps and directions we need to take. This dependence that we find ourselves on today is dangerous for multiple reasons. Environmentally, it's a hazard. It's a drag on our economy. And three, it keeps young men in this country facing the prospect of having to go overseas to defend an untenable appetite that you and I in this country has on oil. If soldiers can uproot themselves from their families all across this great state and go serve, I know we can break our habits and find new ways to fuel our cars, power our homes and our churches and our businesses. And I might add, Mr. Corker, the chairman of my campaign is a farmer. The chairman of my opponent's campaign runs a big old oil company. I ask you, who do you trust in Washington to work this thing out?